physical plant standards to supervision and case management and staffing patterns and all those things. So all those have to be followed in order to receive and be eligible for the funding. Now, there is a waiver process. So any provider can request a waiver to one or more of the standards. That does have to be approved by both the local community corrections board and the referring agencies. And when I speak of referring agencies, there's essentially two types of clients in our halfway houses. There are offenders that are sentenced directly by our adult district court instead of a prison sentence. So these are individuals who likely were unsuccessful at probation or are ineligible for a probation sentence, but a judge believes that a direct sentence to community corrections is a better option than a prison sentence. We refer to those clients as direct sentences or diversion clients. The other population that comes into community corrections are individuals who are in prison. They declare Denver County as a parole destination, meaning they've said they're going to live upon release in the city and county of Denver, and they're referred to community corrections still while serving their prison sentence. Now that might strike some people as concerning, and I understand that, but I would offer to you that the intent there is to allow someone who's earned their way into community corrections, or at least is eligible and is screened by our community corrections board and deemed appropriate for placement in the community, to still kind of demonstrate that they're going to abide by the rules and work on their reentry plan while serving their sentence. Why I keep repeating while serving their sentence, because if they were paroled by the parole board, their institutional time is gone. So having people in halfway houses who are still serving their sentence gives the system greater control over the behavior and the consequences for not following through. Because if someone isn't following the rules in community corrections, they're returned to custody and they continue to serve their sentence back in prison. On the court side, if they're returned to custody, they go back before the judge, and in most situations, the judge will sentence that person to prison. When I'm talking about the state office, and essentially one of the functions of my office is our job is all in this center tree. Our job is to accept the funds from the state, to subcontract for services, or directly provide those services at the county level. The Community Corrections Board sits under this tree. Its job is to screen all placements coming into programs in a county. So anybody in a residential program, in a residential community corrections program under this authority is screened by a locally appointed board. And I'll talk a little bit more about that board in a moment, and certainly Jane can jump in. She's been the chair for a number of years and has been a magnificent chair, and she can kind of share her perspective. To me, this is what makes our kind of model in Colorado unique and successful, because while it's a state funded program, it does have community interests at its core, so long as these community corrections boards always function. And each judicial district in Colorado has these ComCore boards.
Hey, Greg, we have a question in the chat. It's a clarification question. They want to make sure that other people from around the state can come to a Denver program if they choose Denver. That's correct?
That's correct. They can ask to come to Denver and they can be considered. It doesn't mean they'll be accepted. And typically that's more common on people who are reentering through the prison system. For the most part, anybody sentenced by the courts are Denver sentences. The exception to that rule is we have two programs on the grounds of Fort Logan administered by the University of Colorado. They're Pier 1 in Haven. They're part of their addiction research and treatment services. They're specialized substance use dependency programs. And because they're the only therapeutic communities in the state, they will accept court referrals from other jurisdictions. But by and large, everybody else would be a Denver sentence or has declared through their prison case manager that they're going to live in Denver upon release.
We also just want to let everyone know that we're recording this. If you don't want to be on screen, you just turn your camera off.
And one more thing, Greg,
Mhm.
what proportion of people in community corrections are not originally Denver residents?
That I don't have a proportion. I don't have any way of knowing that. I could get you the number of out of county placements in Pier 1 and Haven. I don't have that available today. But the proportion of people that maybe were sentenced out of Arapahoe County, went to prison, but now want to live in Denver County upon release, there's no data system that tracks that.
Well, if Denver is supporting the effort financially, I guess the question is, why wouldn't you know how many of those people in corrections are actual Denver residents that we're helping to support?
Because the state law allows a person in prison to live anywhere they want upon release and to be referred to the county of parole destination in the community corrections statutes and model. So, the logic behind that is you're providing reentry services to someone that says they're going to be living in this community when they're released. So it makes a lot more sense to stabilize them, to get them connected to employment, to treatment services, and to support systems in the community that they're going to be living when they're released from prison and eventually discharge their sentence. It wouldn't make much sense to have someone go to community corrections in one county and then be paroled to an entirely different county and ruin the whole reentry plan of stabilization.
Greg, another question here from the chat. If someone is in federal prison, can they come to Denver from out of state?
Yeah, and this is the first question that's going to take us into what is community corrections that's not part of this system we're talking about today, or that I'm speaking mostly of today. Because the system that I'm showing you here on this screen, that, you know, Denver has decision-making in terms of which clients come into these programs and which programs operate in the city, is completely controlled by state statute and Title 17. The federal system, the Bureau of Prisons, and the U.S. Probation Department may also use halfway houses throughout the country. They are not governed by the state statute. There is a facility in Denver, Independence House. It's on South Federal Boulevard. It's Yale and South Federal. They do contract directly with the feds. Now, there's a whole set of similar regulations in place, but that is not under the purview of the statutes or authority that we're talking about here. Now, where the city does have enforcement action over that program is, and not only the federal program, but all the community corrections programs that I'm going to talk about more in a moment, but also any residential program in the city of Denver that provides for supervision or treatment of an offender is regulated under a local ordinance. It's found in Chapter 26 of the Revised Municipal Code. It's 26-1. It contains all the definitions, you know, of what an offender, of how do you define an offender, how do you define treatment, how do you define supervision, and then the regulations are in 26-15, and the penalties for noncompliance are found in 26-16. So the enforcement of that ordinance also falls under the Department of Safety and has been assigned to the Division of Community Corrections as well. So in addition to the state community corrections or halfway house model that you see illustrated on the slide before you, we also have regulatory ability over a federal program like Independence House to at least have some level of oversight. Our Community Corrections Board doesn't screen those clients, but we can ensure they have adequate staffing. We can ensure there's safety parameters in place. There's case planning going on, things like that. we can also regulate operations that are not part of what we would call community corrections in this model here. So let's say a residential program exists somewhere in Denver. They are providing lodging or housing to a group of individuals. They've been referred by the courts or a corrections agency, and they provide treatment or supervision. Then this ordinance can regulate. Now, what it cannot regulate is a situation where a referring agency from corrections or the courts is only seeking lodging. So if individuals under criminal justice supervision are just referred to a place that provides lodging or housing, that ordinance that I'm talking about does not regulate. And I hope that is not taking us down too many rabbit holes to confuse people, but understand there's multiple arms of regulation when it comes to halfway houses as we would define them. Now, I know sometimes there are concerns from the community, and we just had one recently about an address on South Monaco Parkway. That is not a community corrections program. It is not a program that we're aware of that meets the criteria to be regulated under the Chapter 26 ordinance I just talked about. What I know is I believe that an independent landlord is just renting space to individuals that have justice involvement. And I'm looking at Christine, and I probably shouldn't be, just because I see your face and I don't know if there's a question in there.
That's a lot, what you just, we can unpack that, but I'm not reading all the questions in the chat. What I'm hearing is that there's many layers of regulations and there's many layers of the federal system that finances different transitional and community corrections facilities. And so when I think of this GLAC statute, I'm not really clear on precisely which programs are going to fall under the new and revised regulations that have been proposed.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good time if Andrew wants to jump alongside me just to provide, or we can hold that question for him to better decipher that later on in this presentation or during his.
Yeah, that's, I guess, I don't know what to do because I want to keep going with you, but I do want Andrew. Andrew, could you hold that and come back to exactly where this fits in, how much of this fits into GLAC that Greg is covering?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
So just real quick to finish up this picture. So the referrals come in from our courts, the diversion individuals, they have to be approved by our board. If they're approved by the board and sentenced by the court, they go into our programs. The community corrections programs also have to agree to accept a client, and that applies to both court referred or sentenced individuals, and it applies to individuals from the Department of Corrections. So again, what that hopefully assures people is there's proper vetting of individuals that come into these placements. You have a local community corrections board, you have governing statute or a sentencing judge, and you have the program themselves, all of which are trying to identify the right individual at the right time for that placement. Keep in mind on the Department of Corrections side, you don't have to have people come into community corrections, right? It's not a requirement. They could go straight to parole. But what I would submit to you is that doesn't make a lot of sense from a public safety nor a reentry strategy. If you know anybody who's ever been to prison or been in the justice system, to spend 2 or 3, 4 years incarcerated and to be released straight to the streets. Sometimes there's behavioral health issues that need to be addressed, sometimes just basic stability issues. That is not a good strategy. So and also keep in mind that over 90% of the people that get sentenced to prison come back to our communities. So when somebody goes to prison, that doesn't end the work with that person. It truly only begins, because it's closer to 95% of the folks that get sentenced to DOC come back to our communities. So that's why I believe, and that's why I've spent the better part of almost 25 years now in this system. I believe in the step down strategy. I believe in returning people back through a community reentry model. We want to improve that sort of deinstitutionalization or movement towards more normalcy as we reenter folks. And that's where we're seeing better outcomes and better long-term success for folks coming back. So I think that in a nutshell, let me talk a little bit about the Community Corrections Board if I can. This is who represents the city and communities on our board. There's 21 positions. They serve 4-year terms. They are eligible for reappointment. They're appointed by the mayor and then have to be confirmed by city council. Roughly half of the positions on the board represent agencies within criminal justice at the state or city level, or human services. There's a locally elected official. We have representation from victim service providers, a representative from Denver Public Schools. That's the one vacant position we currently have on the board right now. And then we have 2 persons with experience, knowledge, or expertise in criminal justice. And that can either be professional expertise, or that could be a former client who went through the correction system and is there to make suggestions and improvements. And then 6 individuals who reside and are citizens of the city and county of Denver.
Thank you. Ian, do you think we should go through some of these questions? There's a pile of questions, or should we go to Andrew now?
I think these can answer some of these questions. Here's one from Trisha about how many community corrections facilities are there now in the city? And now that city council has eliminated the relationship with GEO and Core Civic, what is the plan going forward?
Yep. So currently in the city, there are, and when I'm going to talk about zoned facilities that have a use permit to provide services. And that does include the program that works with individuals referred from the federal justice system, the program on South Federal. So Independence House operates 3 facilities for us. The one on South Federal that has a clientele under federal jurisdiction. Then they have 2 programs that fit under the model that I just talked about. One at 41st and Pecos, and one at Colfax and Fillmore, 1479 Fillmore. Core Civic has 4 facilities that are zoned to be able to provide services in the county. Only 3 are operational today. One at 44th and Fox, one at I-70 in Dahlia, and one at 39th and Ulster. Their Columbine facility, located at 42nd and Columbine, was taken offline in June of this year. It's part of our work with Core Civic to slowly transition away from them. After the council decision last summer to end contracts with GEO and eventually Core Civic, we asked for more time to do that in a more strategic and safe way. So the first step with Core Civic was to consolidate and reduce capacity in their operations. And so the Columbine facility was closed in June. Their contract runs through June of 21, and we'll see kind of how that transition away from them progresses. We do have 2 open procurements right now, 2 RFP for services to identify appropriate service providers moving forward. I'm not able to talk about any of those proposals because they are open competitive bids right now. They'll close during the month of November, and we'll be going to council with the results of the RFP December, January. In addition to Independence House and Core Civic, the University of Colorado runs two treatment programs for us, one for women and one for men on the grounds of Fort Logan. So out there in Hampton and kind of federal area. And then the city of Denver has purchased the formerly owned Geo property at 42nd and Kearney Street. And we are in the process of doing some renovations. And one of the RFPs we have would be to resume women's programming out at that location sometime in fiscal year 21. So hopefully first quarter of 21, we'll be able to restart that program. We also have restarted a men's program that was specialized for cognitive behavioral treatment work. And it's located on the grounds of our county jail. So that is, the program is administered by my office. And then we work with the Denver Sheriff's Department to provide some of the safety and security. That's a 48-bed program that we have on the jail campus.
All right, I'm going to keep going to the questions here. Who financially benefits from having non-parole offenders being located within residential neighborhoods?
Well, I would say that the entire community benefits from having community corrections. I don't know that there's a financial incentive to having them in neighborhoods per se. I don't know that there's a disincentive either. I think the idea behind expanding where community corrections can exist in our city has multiple factors. One, under the current zoning laws, we're sort of limited where this operation can occur. I just talked about the sites. I didn't mention the site that closed with Geo at 17th and Williams. Since I've been doing this since in the 90s, those have been the only sites of community corrections. So there's never been an opportunity for a new provider to come into Denver and find affordable land that could be zoned to compete for a contract, offer different services. So if we continue to have such restrictive zoning, we're stuck with the same locations. Another challenge we have is some of these locations can't do any modifications to their property or they risk losing their zoning. So you take a program like Independence House Pecos at 41st and Pecos Street, who's been around forever. They want to make changes to their physical structure and cannot because it jeopardizes their zoning. So as we've asked more of providers in terms of in-house programming, it's a real struggle for them to do that work. Another factor is just aging facilities. When you can't upkeep and provide renovations on site, and Geo experienced this with their William Street program. They wanted to renovate it, they couldn't. So you have aging structures, which is a safety security issue for all. The other option that we've been talking about, and I know this is the one that's been met with certainly a lot of questions, is can you increase options to have potentially smaller programs that are more embedded in neighborhoods and really complete that next step of reentry, which is more normalization, right? Coming out of prison, going into a 110-bed program still feels like an institution. If you think about a next step where after you stabilize and spend some time in that 110-bed program, you can live in a 10, 12, 14, 20-bed program and complete your reentry process, that just makes a lot of sense.
Okay, next question. There's some zoning questions here that I think might be for you, Andrew, so maybe I'll save them for when you're here. Can you tell us how long the board or the position for DPS has been vacant? And with an absence of DPS, is this board making an extra effort to try to reach families through DPS to talk about these changes?
The DPS vacancy has, maybe Jane can jump in if this sounds incorrect. I think it's been vacant for the better part of 4 months. But I will tell you, one of the primary reasons that spot exists on the board is the Community Corrections Board also presides over cases coming out of the juvenile system and going into juvenile residential programming. So typically the member of that from DPS does more work in those Division of Youth Corrections referrals.
Okay. Tanya, I see you have your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Hi, yes, I had a question that was earlier in the chat that we haven't addressed yet, and it's specific to community corrections. I want to know the success rates of these community corrections facilities. What percentage of people in these facilities escape annually? What percentage are returned to prison from these facilities because they were not following the rules and, you know, separate from escaping? And then what percentage are eventually released, like they filled the program and then reoffend later?
All great questions, and I'm going to give you some ranges because every program is going to have slightly different outcomes, but they're going to fit within the ranges. Okay, so the first question was how many complete. So we define completion as making it through the residential program, and people will spend anywhere from 6 months up to 12 to 14 months in the residential part of community corrections. That ranges anywhere from 55%, sometimes a couple percentage points lower, all the way up to 70%. And there's reasons for the variation that I'd be happy to go into, but it'll take us down a rabbit hole. So maybe if there's a follow-up question, I'll provide my contact information at the end of today's call, and I would be happy to talk to anyone and everyone about those variations. The rate of people who are deemed to have walked away, and remember, our state law changed last year. It's no longer considered an escape when someone doesn't return to community corrections. These are not locked facilities. These are individuals that have been screened by the referring agencies or sentenced by the court, screened by the Community Corrections Board. They've been deemed safe. They still battle mental health, substance use, and relationship issues. And we have about 18 to 20% that are allowed to leave the facility who make a poor choice and typically do not return within the specified time. And then they're considered to have walked away. So that's about, I would say, 20%. About 20 to 22%, 24% will be returned to prison because the program believes they're not ready now. They've demonstrated some behavior in-house that is not elevated to new criminal activity, but the programs will terminate them under a technical violation and return them to prison. And nobody likes to see that rate, but I would say it's not necessarily a failure rate, because part of the job of these programs are to filter off who's going to be motivated in their reentry planning and who is not. So while we'd like to see that number in the single digits, I don't view that as a fault of the programs. We do have only less than 2% of the individuals who are in placement who are arrested and committed new crime. And then I think your other question, Tanya, was what happens when they leave?
Yep.
So one of the things that you have to remember, when they leave, they go to other types of supervision. So for Department of Corrections clients, they're either paroled and they're supervised by the parole division, or they move to a program that's called ISP, where they still are serving their prison sentence as an inmate, but they're in an independent living situation. And they're no longer under the auspices of community corrections. So what happens to them post-release is as much sort of a question about what's happening on parole or ISP supervision. But what we know, when folks leave, if they successfully complete community corrections, roughly about 70% of the time, they're crime-free 1 year later.
What about post the 1 year?
I'd have to go back and look. It decreases from that number. I think it's closer to, well, can I circle back to Ian and Christine with that exact number?
Can I ask you a question, Greg? Can you talk to us about oversight of owners and sending people back and back? Because I mean, ultimately, like the for-profit ones, right? They stayed in business because people were cycling in and out of jail. How do you deal with people, with providers, to make sure that they're not just sending people back for a profit motive, I guess, is really what I want to say.
Yeah, I mean, we get that question a lot, but there's really no profit one way or the other, right? Someone's in that bed. So if they fail, it's a negative reflection upon the program, even when they're doing it for the right reasons. So there's no motivation to fail someone. And I would submit that's even a poor choice of words, because ultimately the individual under supervision is making the choice, not the program. Program provides an opportunity to change. They're safe and supportive. If an individual chooses to continue to make poor choices, that's on them. So I don't view there being any profit motive. We do monitor those technical violations and are working hard, not only locally, but statewide, to decrease them, because ultimately the more people that successfully complete community corrections, the more people that won't recidivate 1 and 2 years later. There's been efforts underway to sort of work more under a contingency management model, the appropriate use of rewards and sanctions to change behavior, really working hard at interventions versus just consequences when someone's making a mistake.
Okay, I think there's one last question here that you probably can answer, and then we'll go to Andrew. There's questions in here about the impacts on property value of having these next to your house. I'm sure this would be the first time that question was asked to you, so.
Yeah, and you know, when we went through a zoning expansion back in 2006 through 2008, that question came up. It certainly isn't in our area of expertise to sort of make findings on that, but anecdotally, what I recall is that there's no evidence that suggests that property values decline in or near a community corrections facility because of a community corrections facility being in that vicinity.
Okay, so Andrew, I think we'll go to you to talk about the text amendment. I also am seeing questions here about what zoning types will this be allowed in, et cetera. I think those all fall under your purview. You're on mute.
There you go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thanks. Would it help if I went through a few slides here to maybe talk about the zoning in it before we start answering questions, or you want me just to dive into your questions?
If you have a presentation queued up, go ahead.
So maybe just to bring everybody up to the same level here, I just want to make sure we all understand what we're talking about. So the group living code amendments project does propose making some changes to residential care regulations in the zoning code. These are summarized on the slide that you see on your screen now, with the current on the left and the proposed on the right. Generally speaking, the spirit of the existing regulation would remain where smaller size facilities are easier to establish and have less restrictions, and larger facilities are only allowed in higher intensity zone districts and have spacing requirements and density requirements. So spacing is a requirement on the required space between two facilities, and density refers to the number of total facilities that can be in a specific geographic area. Currently, the code also has limitations, and this has come up a little bit in Greg's comments, so I really want to highlight this. The code does have limitations on what you can do with an existing facility that is non-conforming, either doesn't meet a certain use limitation or is not permitted in the zone district that it's in, was legally established, but at some point the zoning was updated and such a facility would no longer be permitted new if somebody came in and proposed it. Quite a few of the city's existing facilities would fall into those categories. They either they were all legally established at some point, but the zoning has changed around them such that they would no longer be permitted if somebody came in with a new application, or they were legally established but are closer than what is currently required required to a school or to a residential zone district, and so couldn't currently be established if somebody came in with a new application at that site. And the code currently limits the way that a existing facility that falls into those non-conforming categories can operate. There are limitations on even expanding a building, not allowing more people to be served, but just expanding a building to create more area for programming, or to upgrade to meet ADA standards, for example, is limited by the zoning code, because you can't get new zoning permits for those types of things. And so a lot of our, it's not just challenging to establish new facilities, but many of our existing facilities are not able to expand to meet needs. And that's not just community corrections. There are a few shelters that fall into that as well. The proposed changes, as I think many of you know, would do a few things. They would move away from some separate regulations for community corrections and shelter uses. All of these uses are currently in the residential care category of the zoning code and are regulated as residential care uses, but there are, in some cases, additional restrictions or layers of use limitations on shelters and community corrections. These changes would treat all uses the same and would allow any type of residential care use in any location where residential care use is permitted, as currently proposed. Again, the larger facilities would only be allowed in higher intensity zone districts. And as we've talked about with you, I think a few times before, the new public meeting requirement would be established for any facility serving 11 or more people. And if you watch the planning board hearing in August, they also recommended that for any facility serving non-paroled individuals, which is what we refer to as a community corrections facility, regardless of size, they would also have to have that public meeting requirement as well. And then the updates will also allow for existing structures that were legally established and are in use for any type of residential care use to continue operation and to make improvements to their building, to their structures as necessary. Expansion of the number of people served would require application for a new zoning permit and proof that they meet these requirements. But buildings themselves could be improved or expanded and to allow existing facilities to better accommodate the need. The new proposed definition for residential care is shown there on the right. It's not that much different than the current definition in the code. Residential care uses are any use where on-premises treatment of any sort, whether that's custodial supervision, as would be the case in a community corrections, shelter, assistance with day-to-day activities, those would all fall into residential care. And I would just highlight here that, as is currently the case, community or corrections institutions like prisons and jails are not currently residential care use and would not be a residential care use moving forward. So nothing would change about the way formal jail and prison type facilities are regulated. This map actually shows the current places where community corrections can be established, along with the existing facilities, and we've tried to represent the current spacing and density limitations as well around those. You can find these slides on our website. If you want to zoom in on them, they might be a little bit easier to read on a computer screen where you can actually zoom in. But as you can see, there's very little area currently where community corrections facilities could be established. This slide shows that what is proposed to change in the current spacing and density requirements. So there is currently a 2,000 foot spacing requirement for community corrections facilities, and then no more than 2 other such uses within a 4,000 foot radius. That's the density limitation. We're proposing to change that by shrinking the spacing a little bit down to a less arbitrary standard of 3 blocks, or about 3 blocks, I should say, a 1,200 foot radius. And then the density limitation would move to a mile, generally the width of most of the kind of core statistical neighborhoods in Denver. with no more than 3 such uses permitted in an area when a subject site is being considered for a new zoning permit. And then this map shows what those new spacing and density would look like, requirements would look like from the existing facilities, with all of the zone districts where community corrections are proposed to be allowed by the group living code amendments. And I will just note here that we've heard a lot of feedback and concern about allowing community corrections specifically in residential zone districts, and we'll be going back. Hopefully, some of you have been you've been following the process at the City Council's Land Use, Transportation, and Infrastructure Subcommittee, or LUTI. We'll be going back to them, going back to our calendar slide here. On November 10th, we'll have a full meeting discussion at LUTI about residential care and some of the concerns that they have raised, and we'll be proposing some alternatives for them to consider to address some of those concerns. And one of those that we'll discuss with them is not permitting non-paroled individuals in the low intensity residential districts like single unit and 2 units. So the council will be having a discussion about whether to maybe take a second look at a slightly different approach to community corrections than from other residential care. So with that, I'll stop, and I can hop to other slides as necessary as questions come in. And Ian, if you want to go ahead and
Tanya has her hand up and is raising her hand, so I know she wants to get in. Go ahead.
So slide 41, if you could just go back a couple. To the one that shows current versus proposed spacing changes.
Mm-hmm.
There. So on this one of the things that's in the zoning code that's not mentioned on here, and that's critical, is that there is a spacing requirement between community corrections facilities and schools. So
That's
why
right.
isn't that on here?
Yeah, the proposed change would remove the current buffer requirement to schools and residential zone districts.
Why is that, and why isn't that on here? That is critical. DPS parents don't know about this, and when they find out, they are horrified. So why isn't that on this map, and why was the decision made to remove that in the proposal?
So it is reflected on this map. It's not shown from every single school, but you can see some areas here where the presence of a nearby school has cut into essentially what would be a permitted area for. Why aren't you calling it out in the slides? That seems really intentional and deceptive. Parents need to know. So why was that decision made? Because there are too many schools, so you just decided to throw that out the window? I can speak to why the decision was made. There are many schools, and as a result, between the current buffers from schools and residential districts leaves very little land, even in commercial areas, available for community corrections uses. We also know that there is no evidence that those arbitrary buffer requirements actually have an impact on safety near schools or near residential districts or anywhere else.
Isn't that because right now they're not in residential areas? It just seems like a really dangerous experiment, an unfair experiment. And the fact that your group has not reached out to DPS and DPS hasn't hosted a meeting for parents to let them know about this, it seems very deceptive.
So a couple things there. I would say about half of the existing facilities are currently in residential areas, and most of them are near existing schools, in most cases, several schools. And
with the
we
1,500
have also,
with the buffer, though, because
not within the buffer. They were legally established before the buffer requirement was enacted. So they are in most cases right near schools. Okay.
And so when did you talk to DPS about this?
We met with DPS about 3 weeks ago now.
Okay. And what was the outcome?
We explained what is proposed and our reasoning behind it, and have told them that we would be more than happy to come and present to the school board as well, and anybody else who is interested.
And the parents. Yeah, I think there needs to be a parent meeting.
The next question that I see here, this one's also from you, Tanya, but if the zoning code is preventing upgrades to existing community corrections facilities and homeless shelters, why not update the zoning code for those locations versus the entire city?
Sure. So, and one thing I should note is that shelters are actually permitted in all zone districts of most types, and exist all over the city. They don't have the same quite the same limitations that that community corrections do. But it is true that existing shelters and that are non-conforming, as is the case with community corrections that are not meeting certain zoning standards or not permitted in the districts that they're in now, cannot improve buildings or expand buildings to meet ADA requirements and that sort of thing. And these changes would allow that. However, what they would not permit is the automatic expansion of the number of guests served at those facilities. So in many cases, there are existing facilities that could do better work with the populations they have now if they were able to use their existing space more efficiently for those services. And that's true of shelters as well, several of which are fairly dated buildings that lack elevators and that sort of thing. And that would be allowed by these changes. Expansion of those facilities in terms of the number of guests served would require a new zoning permit. And in that case, you would have to prove that you meet the new proposed zoning requirements and spacing and public meeting requirements, that sort of thing.
Paige,
So in other words, we're doing a little bit of both, but the allowance, the new flexibility for existing sites allows them to improve their buildings and upgrade their facilities, but to actually expand services there, as would be the case with a new facility, they would have to apply for a new zoning permit.
Paige, I see that you have a couple of questions in here. I was going to read them. Do you want to just ask your question instead? You're on mute, Paige. Paige, you're still on mute. Can I unmute her? Maybe I can. She's still, Paige, can you hear me? Because you're still on mute, I think.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I did my video. I forgot to do the mute. So I think there's still some confusion for residential care facilities under the group living amendment. These aren't folks that are paroled. I mean, they could be, but they're also folks that are still serving their sentence under their sentence. Is that correct?
When we talk about community corrections facilities, these are non-paroled individuals, yes.
Because there's a lot of misconceptions on that out in the community, because when I say that I'm opposed to that, because I am opposed to that, I'll just put it out there. People say, well, they're paroled. Well, they're not paroled. They are still serving their sentence. And I guess this goes back to some of the questions that I put in there. Why would you, Andrew or Greg, I mean, I'm assuming you're both Denver residents, would you want to have a small community corrections facility next to your house? And I don't know if you have kids. My kids are older now, but when I had small kids, I didn't choose my neighborhood for that. And I think that you're going to have a lot of people leaving Denver if this goes through the way it's written. So that's my overall comment on everything.
Hey, Andrew, do you mind if I jump in here and just share some thoughts?
Yeah, of course.
All great questions. I guess, let me just if I can just put this out there for people to think about. Again, I mentioned you can not have community corrections. That doesn't stop the 95% of folks that are coming back out of prison from living in your community. To me, I would absolutely rather have a facility by me that's staffed 24/7, that has structure to it, that rules are in place for people returning from prison to go into, than living in unstructured environments, in independent living situations, worse yet, that are homeless. So I think it's not an either or. I mean, you really have to think about public safety in the broader context, and it just makes more sense to bring people back through supervised, structured release, because they're going to get out anyway. And if you think that there are not offenders who live in your neighborhood, who work at your grocery store, who work in your home on home improvements, then I don't think you're really understanding that folks come back from prison. And I say that only to just kind of set the expectation that, it just makes sense, public safety, to bring people back. And then, Paige, your question about opposed to having them be inmates, I'll just kind of reiterate what I said. If you understand our sentencing structure, when someone gets a 10-year sentence to the Department of Corrections and then a 4-year parole period, if the parole board paroles that person after serving 5 years, their sentence is done. Even if they go out and commit a new crime or do all kinds of things on parole, they can't go back and reinstitute that sentence. When someone's in community corrections while they're still serving their sentence, if there's any reason, even a rule infraction, they go back and continue to serve their sentence. So there is much tighter controls on someone who's still serving their sentence than wanting the parole board to parole someone.
So can I ask one follow-up to that? So where has this been done? Where have community corrections been put in residential neighborhoods to show that this is beneficial? Like, where have cities done this, or are we the first to do this and this is kind of a Denver experiment? Where has this been done in other cities, and what were the outcomes, and where's that data?
Well, I think if you go back to the history of community corrections in Denver, programs started in residential neighborhoods. So the very first programs were at 41st and Pecos, 17th and Williams Street, and there were some other locations in Cap Hill. Through the need to expand and through a lot of other reasons, they eventually became restricted and moved into industrial areas. So I think there's history in Denver of them being in residential neighborhoods.
Okay, Trisha, I see you've had your hand up and we haven't had a chance to talk yet, so.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ian. I appreciate it. I'm gonna try to figure out how to get my video off. But you know what? I'll just go ahead and ask my questions. I feel like we're talking at cross purposes. Like, I feel like there's people are, there's people who have a lot of information and a lot of experience on this issue, and then there's people who just found out through the group living amendment proposal that, oh, you're going to have a community correction facility, right next door to you. And so when you have that diverse a group of understanding, you're never going to come to a solution that makes sense, right? So I'm a big proponent of data, right? It's just how I operate. It's how I like to think. And I think that there's been a real lack of education, quite frankly, from the city and people who have the information on community correction facilities and all this to your regular residents so that they can understand what the true impact of all of this would be. And there's lots of questions here, right? Which is, not only, what Paige just asked, which is where's the evidence of peer city analysis and how has this been successful or not been successful? And I think that information is out there, right? And I think there's a lot of research that's been done on those types of questions. So if you could educate people on that data, that would be and bring everybody up to the same starting point. I'm not going to say you're going to get people to want to agree to have a community corrections facility next to them, but I also think you owe the residents, are you going to close the existing facilities that, Greg, you talked about earlier and want to spread them out to the smaller facilities within the city? Is there a need for more facilities? I mean, how many, what's the number of people that are placed versus the number of available beds? If you've already, I can't believe that the city hasn't already mapped out a strategy for how, if group living were to pass, this might look within the city. So what is that? What does that look like for residents? I think, again, the more data you can provide and the more hard analysis that you can do, then the more everybody can come together and understand and operate from the same page. And so, Greg, my push to you and to Andrew is give us the data. Like, give us some hard facts. Don't just come with a proposal that suddenly, upends everything for people who don't have, a better understanding of this issue, because you're not going to get people to where you want them to get to. At least I don't believe, you won't get them in my neighborhood to where you want them to get to, that's for sure. And I think that would be a shame, because I do think that there is a need for a change in how things are done, clearly, currently. So that's, again, to Greg and to Andrew, where's the data? Show us the analysis and show us the data, please.
I just want to add that I'm seeing a lot of people echo agreement here in the chat about where is the data justifying the need for expansion through the rest of the city.
And we can certainly, I think, try to characterize the need. What I will say about zoning is that it doesn't direct or dictate where new facilities go or the operation or expansion of facilities. As Greg has said, most of these are operated by private contractors to the city, and ultimately it's up to them based on their perceptions of market demand to establish and explore options for and then establish new facilities. Generally, what we have heard through the whole group living effort is that the current scenario of larger facilities, both in community corrections and shelters as well, concentrated only in a few parts of the city, is not serving those clients as well as a smaller, more equitably distributed and smaller, more therapeutic programs could around the city. So zoning can't tell those operators to change the way they operate and to open new facilities, but it can acknowledge that those facilities, if somebody wants to establish one, could be put somewhere. And so we're basically saying, let's make sure that zoning is not an obstacle to, not in the way of a more equitable distribution of facilities and smaller, more therapeutic facilities. The rate of new facilities being opened in both community corrections and in shelters is low. It's one every few years or so. So we would not expect a sudden explosion of either type of use. But we want to make sure that that zoning is not essentially continuing the ongoing concentration of these uses in North Denver and along the Platte.
No, Andrew, this is Tricia again, and I get that. And you talk about market demand and these private contractors, and there were people on the ZAP Committee who probably spoke to that need, right? So yeah. They obviously have some sense of analysis, and that to me is the question. Like, why can't that analysis be shared with people? I think that's what's missing here. This just seems to again have come in a vacuum and in a silo. And if you don't have the analysis, because what you just said is, it's contradictory, right? You said there's market demand, but then you also just said the rate of openings have been very low, so it's not going to be explosive. So there's some sense out there, right? There's clearly analysis that's been done, and so is there a need? Is there not a need? That's where people get really confused, and to have clarity, I think, would be huge.
Andrew, let me jump in here. So is that Tricia who's asking that question?
Yeah, it is. Thanks.
Yeah. So pre-pandemic levels, right? Denver operated a capacity of about 685 to 700 individuals in placement across the facilities that were in operation going back several years. At the same time, we had those individuals in those beds, and we have to remember these are people. So I refer to them as a bed in a facility, but these are individuals in these beds. We also had well over 100 people waiting to come into community corrections on any given day from the Department of Corrections. we oftentimes had 30 or 40 people waiting in our jail, waiting to get into a community corrections bed, because for those that get accepted from the courts, they sit in jail until there's a bed open for them. We had in excess of 250 to 300 referrals that our board was trying to screen on any given day. So there was clearly a demand. Now, I think some will point to the reduction efforts going on in both prison and jails during the pandemic. And I think it's extremely, I would not try to predict what's happening in the past 10 months with what corrections populations might look like 2 years from now. So I would say there's plenty of evidence to say that Denver could and needs to have anywhere between 650 and 750 beds in our community to provide adequate reentry services. And with all those numbers I just cited, still only less than 40% of the DOC population that gets out comes to community corrections. So if Denverites would like to see more people come through a structured setting, then you would even need more beds than I just explained there. But historically, our system ran in that 650 to 700 range, provided reentry services for about 38% of folks coming out of prison in our direct sentences, and had long wait lists.
Greg, I just want to add on, and I think some people might be missing this pack too. Not only do you get more structure and people can get sent back, I think you need to think about the impacts for the family. You know, my father spent more than 12 years in prison, and going and visiting him in Southern Colorado was really difficult. And so when you have people who are placed back in the community, not only can they get employment and get back on their feet, they can get the substance abuse treatment, the mental health, they also can get checked and sent back to jail, but they can have their families. And I think that that's a part that people really, you know, unless you've had someone who's gone to jail, the distance and the inability to really visit them, even a phone call can cost $15. And so there's a really additive benefit there that I just want to point out. Jane, I know you asked like several questions in the chat, and I see your hand's finally up, so I'd love to let you come in.
Hi, good morning. So I'm just going to talk about the value of homes. I'm a senior, and I've heard people in Montbello, West Denver, Central Denver, North Denver, South Denver, all over, worry about the value of their homes if a corrections facility were to move in next door, or a homeless shelter. What does that do to home values in the immediate area of that facility? And have there been any studies on that? I'm hoping to use my home and the equity to age in place. But if the value goes down because people don't want to pay as much for my home, or I can't get a line of credit, like a reverse mortgage that would satisfy the need, then I have to move. How fair is that?
Jane, I can respond to that. So we've looked at, and this is a question that comes up all the time in every city that is dealing with, you know, trying to figure out where to allow things like shelters and other similar uses. The most of the body of academic research that we have been able to find out there suggests that there is not a profound impact to property values from the existence nearby of a shelter or of what is more commonly called like a halfway house in other communities. And it's especially notable when you compare that impact to property values of nearby big traffic generators like shopping centers or even really busy streets have been found to have a much more observable impact on property values than the presence of a residential care facility. And I would further note that, you know, a home that is being used, a house that's being used as a care facility, has to have the appearance of a house and still has to be maintained just like a house. And so it's not as though a large institutional structure, for example, could be built right next to somebody's house. There are already probably 52 small residential care facilities operating in houses all around the city now, and many of them, I would say, probably are not even well known by neighbors, although they are mapped, and you can go on our project website and see a map of all those facilities. So we did put a link to some of those the studies that have been done on property values on our project website, and I'll drop that in the chat or the website address.
Andrew, may I ask a follow-up?
Of course.
Those facilities currently are operating under the current zoning, which limits how many people can live in a facility. If you up the ante where more people can live in a facility, I challenge that that's going to devalue the home. If it's the same home and you just double the number of people living there, I'm concerned about that. Because the opportunity in some of the numbers I've heard today for somebody to go off the rails, either walk away or do a crime or something, is going to rise with the numbers.
So a few things to note there. The smallest facilities in Denver now, the small residential care facilities serve 8 or fewer people. The proposed change would allow them to serve 10 or fewer people, so not a huge number of more people. And I would also just highlight that both the external standards that regulate the operation of those types of facilities, like the state and city standards for community corrections, the standards for assisted living, standards for recovery homes, all have minimum space requirements and staffing requirements that would also limit the number of people that could be served in a structure that's the size of a house. And then fire requirements also kick in. So in Denver, any structure serving a residential use for more than 10 people has to have a sprinkler system, which gets pretty expensive when you're looking at doing that in a house. There are requirements for what constitutes a sleeping area in terms of ensuring that you have egress windows and that sort of thing. So I don't think these changes would result in a major expansion in the number of people served in a single residential care facility, and even if it's in a house.
Okay, so you're talking about one property at a time. So what if there's 5 or 6 residential cares in a particular neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
And there's parolee houses, which are not governed by anybody. A parolee gets a voucher and somebody says, yeah, you can rent here, like in my neighborhood. How much of that could one neighborhood manage? And who are the people that we call if it gets out of hand and the trash isn't picked up or people are disturbing the peace, and you're cutting back on the police force and you're cutting back on 311? You don't have the money right now because of COVID. This is just so wrong right now for experiments.
Understood.
You can't, can you?
Pardon me?
You're not answering me.
I wasn't sure. So what was the specific follow-up question?
How much can a neighborhood expect to get in one area if you're speaking one house at a time and, oh, this is all perfect and contained and managed? Okay, so we're going to try it 5 doors down and then a block over and 2 blocks over. And then maybe on this corner house, we'll stick some other stuff because it seems to be okay in this neighborhood.
So there are currently—
Pardon my voice, I'm a little emotional about this.
Understood. So there are currently, and there would still be, spacing requirements for larger facilities, those serving more than 10 people. And so you couldn't concentrate those larger facilities in any one neighborhood. Currently,
I'm talking small. I'm talking small.
yeah, currently the small facilities do not have a spacing requirement. That may be something that we also discuss with council on when we come back to them on the 10th. You know, there may be a justification for like a density limitation that says, you know, you can only have so many within a square mile as we're proposing for larger facilities. In terms of enforcement, the same, aside from the, you know, a lot of facilities have to be licensed by the city. A lot of facilities, a community corrections facility has oversight by the Department of Safety. And any facility, the zoning permit is revocable. So if there is a record of ongoing problems at a site, especially if they are problems with zoning related issues, those permits can be taken away. And our code enforcement division works with the operators of all types of residential care homes to make sure that they are meeting their maintenance requirements, that they are providing the required off-street parking. And in terms of, you know, police budgets, I'm not aware of, and really can't speak to changes in policing, but certainly our land use enforcement work within CPD is robust, and we do address every call that comes into 311 in most cases within 24 hours and try to bring people into compliance.
Hey, Andrew.
So prisons, so Greg Mauro and Andrew Webb don't talk together about what might go on in any single neighborhood. The silos are what worry me the most, because everybody's in their own arena of operation. I just want you all to consider that, and I'll stop talking.
Hey, Andrew.
And if I could just follow up quickly to that, I will say that we work closely with all city agencies that have a stake in where residential care facilities go, including Department of Safety from the very beginning of the process. That was one of the goals of our advisory committee, was to make sure that we had people on it that could speak to their either lived or occupational experience with how these facilities work and how decisions are made about where they go, that sort of thing.
Andrew, I just want to get clarification, because I've heard this asked several times and I don't think I heard it answered. Is this experimental, or has this been done in other cities?
Well, we're just talking about zoning here, so we don't open facilities, but there are other cities that allow community corrections facilities in residential neighborhoods. We have a chart of other res care specific to community corrections regulations on our project website as well, that you can go take a look at. And other cities vary their approach in terms of buffering from different uses like schools and that sort of thing. I would say that the current state requirements for operating a community corrections facility mean that larger facilities are have some advantage in terms of being able to meet the reporting and compliance requirements, and that we don't see a lot of smaller facilities serving non-paroled individuals, but they do exist. They have existed here in the past, and they do exist in other places as well. I don't know if I would call it an experiment, but it would allow operators who want to look at a smaller, more therapeutic model that can meet the strict requirements of both the city and the state's operational standards to do so.
Okay,
Ian, can I pose a question to the members of INC?
go ahead.
I would just love to hear some feedback. If we acknowledge, and the data supports it and we can provide it, that 90+% of folks come back and live in communities, what's the objection to having folks come back where there's structure and supervision and monitoring, as opposed to the 90+% coming back and living in communities without those services? That's the piece that I struggle with is if you want a model that is grounded in public safety and accountability, you want supervised structured facilities. You're not going to stop people from returning back to the community from prison. You're only going to stop the ability to have them come back in a structured way. So help me understand that disconnect and that concern.
We have the facilities already. Why don't we just keep those?
Yeah, so the response there is the current owners own those buildings.
Yep.
So with limited zoning, right now, when council said Geo and CoreCivic are not in the long range plans for the city, we can't contract with them. We can't force them to sell their properties. They can do whatever they want with them.
That's a short-term problem that was caused by city council not thinking through the decision and just trying to make a public statement. So that's their problem to fix, and it shouldn't be on the backs of Denver residents throughout the city.
I would say that that's incorrect. The city council represents us. So if they made a decision, that is not on the 13 members of the city council. That's on the 760,000.
No, they did it as a big political statement. Many of them were new and they didn't know what the F they were doing. And they caused this problem. And I do not want to be the solution to their short-term thinking.
Okay.
My sense of safety and well-being is not going to be played with. And I will continue to fight this. This is crazy.
Greg, I for one am not, to answer your question, I'm not concerned. I think we need things like this in our community. So thank you.
Adrian, I see you've had your hand up. We're half an hour over time before our next topic. So,
and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm going to read what I put on the chat, or will put on the chat. The Baker experience about corrections facilities, community facilities and so forth of whatever size, mostly relatively small, is that you can tell the residential care and other facilities we have only by how nicely they're maintained and how quiet they are. That is not true of rental properties or even privately owned properties, which have essentially no effective controls. I have standing because I have had more than 3 such facilities within 3 blocks of my house for the last 20 years, and I've raised my family with them in complete safety. And on the very few occasions when there have been issues, the worst of which has been lawn not mowed that I can recall, the facilities have been immediately responsive to neighborhood concerns and fixed them. The key is the facilities are managed, as Greg has been saying and Andrew has been saying for so long. And the reality is that if we ever did get reliable statistics, for which there are, I think, severe personal liberty and personal information problems, I think that we would find that these are things that improve property values because they improve neighborhoods. I understand the concerns, they're theoretical. My observation, which is not theoretical, is that these are necessary, beneficial units for neighborhoods as well as for the clients they serve.
okay, Adrian, I do see Michael Henry suggested we ask the chair of the Community Corrections, Jan, if she had anything she wanted to add to close us out, and I think we're going to go on to the next topic.
First of all, my name is Jane, not Jan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, I have been a chairman for a long time, and I have very mixed feelings about this ordinance. I think it's being pushed through without a lot of information, as has been said before. There's a reason that they are not in the neighborhoods any longer, and that was because of community pushback. There's a reason that there are facilities that are larger, and that's financial. I put something in earlier. Statewide providers will tell you that in order to make the reimbursements work, you need to have a facility with at least 40 people. Otherwise, it doesn't work financially, which is why a lot of the people have gotten out of the business. I think it's also important to know that with 2 exceptions, all of these organizations are for-profit entities. They're not non-for-profits. And the reason they're not non-for-profit is because they need to be for-profit in order to get the kind of financial backing that they need. You can talk to Manny Rodriguez about that. He's more than happy to tell you. So I think that not telling the neighborhood, which is Andrew, which is what you're suggesting, that these facilities are going in is wrong. I agree with Greg, and I have fought long years to say that it's better to have some kind of supervision for people coming out of the prison or people who would have otherwise gone to prison before they're released automatically into the community, which is what the Department of Corrections is doing right now. And I think you should all be concerned about that. They want to bypass community corrections boards. They want to bypass local control. And I think that's evidenced every single day. You can talk about, I don't know, Andrew, you talk about all of your enforcement. What have you done about the street, the property on Monaco? So I think there are 2 sides to this story. And yes, I agree that community corrections is a very, very valuable service, but I don't agree that it's a service that should be slid into neighborhoods without proper vetting by the community to see if they want it. The reason that those small facilities closed was because there were problems. And believe me, you know, I have heard people say, oh, these are just low-level offenders. That's not true, folks. There are a lot of violent offenders. I see them every month, sometimes twice a month, and they are not people that you necessarily think are going to do a good job. And you can talk to the providers about that and they'll tell you the same thing. So I think it should be very carefully reviewed. I lived down the block from a community corrections facility that did a good job. Unfortunately, it was closed because of neighborhood concerns. So, you know, I think you really need to look into this and not let the city, not let Andrew and his people try to slide this through.
So I've put in the chat, thank Greg and thank you, Andrew, but thank you, Greg, for your question. And we'll try to, Ian and I will try to figure out a way, because I think there probably is input on how this could be done in a way that benefits those coming out of the system, and also it doesn't alarm neighborhoods. So I really appreciate, Greg, that you were willing to come and speak. And maybe we'll have you again to answer some of the data questions. So
thank you for inviting me. I will put my phone and email contact in the chat. And if anyone wants to follow up in the coming days or weeks or months or years, just please feel free to reach out to me.
Okay. And Andrew's going to stay, but Greg, I don't think you need to stay for this. So if you want, you can. So we're going to move into the Chapter 59 discussion now. And for those of you who are not aware, and Denver exists under 2 separate zoning codes. When we did the new code in 2010, about a little less than 80% of the city was brought into that. But areas like my area, which have really complicated zoning. I'm R2A with waivers and conditions in a planned building group. It was too much for the city planners to figure out how to put us in the new code. So we wound up with some areas like mine, which are still in the old code, and some in the new code. And that has sort of, CPD unfortunately has forgotten about it. There's only 2 people who were involved in the planning code, in the new code in 2010, who are still even on the city planning staff. So we have kind of an information gap, and maybe the institutional memory sort of faded, and we forgot about it until it was recently brought up with regard to both the tent sites and with regard to restaurant licensing on expanding patios, and then with regard to group living. So Andrew is going to speak about it and give us not only the background, but some of CPD's ideas for moving forward.
Christine, if I could just jump in for a second, just
Yeah.
a little bit more background about why we chose this topic is
Oh.
we see a fair amount of power that is going into the Accessory and the administrator to make decisions. And so when we saw that, Christine and I said, oh, we got to get someone in here to talk about this, because if you're going to consolidate more power into a person, there definitely should be community engagement on it.
Yeah, and by the way, Tina Axelrod is the arbiter of when these permits on community corrections are pulled, because there is no review process in the community under the new system. So there's a lot of power there. I agree. And we had wanted Tina to come, but I'm not sure exactly why she couldn't, but we have Andrew, so.
The second place prize. So thanks again for teeing up the discussion here. One real quick clarification I want to make is that in the case of community corrections, there would be community notification. So what we are proposing with these amendments is a new requirement for a public meeting in advance of establishment of any residential care facility serving 11 or more people, or a facility of any size serving a group of people who are non-paroled individuals. So that means even a halfway house type use in a neighborhood, in a house serving just a few people. If it is a group of non-paroled individuals and they're operating under the auspices of the city's Chapter 26 regulations and the state community correction standards and statutes, they would have to have a meeting up front, and mailed notification would have to be sent to neighbors, including renters and businesses within 400 feet of the site. And I saw somebody in the chat ask if this was if we were taking away use permits, and the answer is no. You would still have to have you'd still have to apply for a zoning permit for residential care use of any size, as is currently the case. But under these new proposed rules, you would also have to have a meeting with a neighborhood before you applied for that zoning permit, to give people a chance to understand what's happening and to get to know the operator and potential clients of that facility. So moving on to Chapter 59, the map that should be up in your, sure.
One question on that. Are you saying that the new ZPCIM requirement is more stringent than the ZPIN requirement?
It would be, because ZPIN just requires notification to be sent to the RNO and the city council member, and no meeting or anything like that, and no indication to recipients of that notification of how they could learn more or who they write to about it. The criteria for approval remain the same. The zoning administrator and the city's zoning permit review team review zoning permits against the criteria in the zoning code, and so they don't make decisions now, nor would they in the future, based on whether or not the community likes a use. If a use is permitted in a zone district, and so residential care uses are currently permitted in zone districts, and they would be in the future, if the proposal meets the requirements of the zoning code, can show that it meets the spacing requirements and the density limitations, that sort of thing, it will be approved. But this goes beyond the ZPIN to provide more notification to neighbors of who's coming in and what they are planning to do, and the opportunity for neighbors to actually meet with that operator.
But there's no 1-year review. No, it never comes back.
As is currently the case, there is not. Yeah, there's not a annual review of permits or anything like that. But as I've said before, permits are revocable for repeated violations of the zoning code.
Thank you.
So this map shows the areas that are under the old code, or what we now call former Chapter 59. And as Christine kind of teed it up, these were areas that either had highly customized zoning or had approved site plans that were just awaiting the capitalization of development, that sort of thing. And so for those various reasons, they were left as they were when the new code was adopted in 2010. Many of the sites with custom zoning didn't have a clear sort of analog in the new zone code that could just be automatically applied. So they needed site-by-site analysis. And CPD has done that work over the years, but certainly I think not as fast as we had hoped. Significant areas have been rezoned. For instance, up here around 38th and Blake, a legislative rezoning project back in 2018 pulled many of those properties into the new zoning code, or into the Denver zoning code. And as people come in to develop, we typically try to incentivize property owners to bring their properties into the new code as well. However, as you can see on this map, there is about a little over 20% of the city that still remains under the auspices of the old code. And these proposed amendments to group living are to the Denver zoning code. And so they would not on their face automatically impact areas under former Chapter 59. And some stakeholders and council members have pointed out the inequities there. And we as CPD agree. Christine also mentioned that the zoning administrator was recently given the ability to approve for temporary unlisted uses in former Chapter 59. So the Denver zoning code already allows the zoning administrator to permit what we would call a temporary unlisted use. It's an unlisted use is a use that hadn't been previously contemplated and given a definition in the zoning code, but that has come to exist since the zoning code was adopted. And the first tiny home villages were a good example of that. It was a use that hadn't been thought of back in 2010 when the Denver zoning code was adopted. And so in the early stages of establishing the tiny home village in North Denver, the zoning administrator used that ability, that provision, to issue temporary unlisted use permits. Former Chapter 59 did not have those provisions for temporary unlisted uses. And as you can see, there are still places all over the city that have former Chapter 59 here. And so the City Council about 3 weeks ago adopted an ordinance that gives the zoning administrator the power to issue temporary unlisted use permits in areas of former Chapter 59 that can stay in effect until emergency declarations related to COVID-19 are lifted. And the two key purposes of those, as Christine mentioned, are to allow for the same flexibility that we've allowed restaurants in the Denver zoning code to expand into parking areas for outdoor dining, and also to allow for a safe outdoor camping sites or other uses to address the crisis of homelessness that we're experiencing right now. So essentially, it extends an allowance that exists in areas that are in gray here under the Denver zoning code to those areas in former Chapter 59. And then separately from that, because of the feedback we've heard about the group living amendments and the fact that they wouldn't automatically apply in former Chapter 59, we don't really have anything definitive yet, and we haven't had the chance to discuss this with City Council and get their perspective and priorities. However, we are, I would say, in the early stages of exploring a few options to include more proactive rezoning of all those areas, potentially assigning a team within my group, Planning Services, to more actively do that analysis of what an appropriate new zone district in the Denver zoning code would fit in some of these areas in the next couple of years. to bring all the rest of the city into the Denver zoning code, which is our ultimate goal, is to have all the city under the Denver zoning code under one code and retire former Chapter 59. We are also looking at options for further incentivizing and maybe even requiring it as a requirement of development. So especially in areas of the city that are not developed, or that are still kind of a patchwork of development up toward north of Green Valley Land, for example, where if an operator or if a landowner wants to do development there, that they through the large development review process would have to rezone into the Denver zoning code, which we have offered at no cost since 2010. And then finally, we're also looking at options that would potentially bridge some of the regulations in the code, if the group living amendments are adopted, that would bridge some of those provisions in the Denver zoning code to areas under former Chapter 59. So an example of that, and these are all sort of conceptual at this point, but an example of that would be allowing, for example, if the regulations that impact households in Denver that we proposed to change under the group living code amendments, if they are adopted, that those definitions would also be optional definitions that by which a household could operate under in an area zone with former Chapter 59. But again, I want to highlight that none of these have been decided on yet. We'll be going back to the City Council on November 17th to review some of these options with the LUDI, the Land Use, Transportation, and Infrastructure Committee, and get their input as to which should be a priority, and that will help guide our decisions about which of these options that we would focus on. So none of these are a sure thing, and we have not begun any of these, but these are options that we are contemplating right now to address former Chapter 59, because we do agree that as the rest of the city, as the Denver zoning code continues to be updated and modernized, that the inequities between the two codes are more pronounced. And certainly the group living project has been a good opportunity to observe and think about that. So happy to answer any questions to the degree that I can, and would just highlight that you may want to tune in to the LUDI hearing or meeting on the 17th to hear what some of the council members think of some of these ideas.
I have comments, but let's see if there's anybody else with their hand up. Oh boy, this might be a little too nerdy for some people. They left.
Yeah.
But I would like to raise a couple of issues. The first being that I think it's important for people to know that many of the areas, such as my area, which is Lowry, were put into the old code with custom zoning in order to get more density. We're far more dense, smaller lots, less yards, less green space, some bigger houses, more mixed use, tons of different apartments and condos and townhomes, lots of varied zoning. But the planned building groups were done because the developers couldn't squeeze as many houses into the lots under the old code. So the city, it did serve the city's purposes for many years to allow development to take place under the old code. But I am kind of concerned that after 2010, why did that continue when you already had the new code tools, like the Den Airport or parts of Green Valley? And why did that continue after 2010?
Well, I would say that the ones that continue were those that already had approved site plans that had gone through the Development Services site plan review process. Those that have come in since then, in most cases, we have encouraged them to come into Denver zoning code to rezone out of former Chapter 59 before development, but it hasn't been a requirement, and some areas have continued to develop undeveloped land or establish uses under former Chapter 59, and it is, you know, essentially it's a big challenging puzzle that you know we see now is worth spending some more time and focusing some more time on really untangling and updating in those areas of former Chapter 59.
I was there, so I heard the discussion was to not allow any more PUDs, and we're still doing PUDs. I'm a little confused at the discretionary aspect of this, I guess.
Yeah, so a big change with the new code was moving away from PUDs or planned unit development, and that is essentially custom zoning that tailors very specific uses to a certain site. And the challenge with those is a challenge we see profoundly now, where a lot of PUDs become very outdated and then render a lot of sites undevelopable. So a lot of properties have come out of former Chapter 59 PUDs in recent years because the limitations were based on, a plan they had in the 1980s or the 1990s that doesn't really fit with current development patterns. We still do occasionally allow PUDs, and the city has a clear policy on and a set of criteria for requesting and approving a PUD. It's in the zoning code, and we actually have a web page devoted to it as well that sets forth what are the conditions under which we will approve a PUD, and it has to typically involve a significant public benefit like historic preservation or creation of publicly accessible open space. And so I would say that, versus the 100 or so or more maybe that were established under former Chapter 59, when PUDs were seen as or were a more common approach. We've done maybe 20 under the Denver zoning code, and those are in very unique cases, uniquely situated locations that such as along the South Platte that provide an opportunity for open space and that sort of thing. But it's not something we do a lot anymore. But we do have all those existing former Chapter 59 PUDs that don't have easy analogs in the zoning code. So we are looking at a potential project to really have planners focus on each one of those one by one and dig into the individualized use limitations and building requirements and that sort of thing, and find and assign better analogs from the Denver zoning code to those sites.
So I'll go on a little longer, and then I see people are writing. One major problem, in my view, is that when we were at the table, all of us who were here in 2007, 8, 9, 10, and we were working on where our neighborhood should go and what the built environment looked like and what would be appropriate. Did we have garages in the back or garages in the front? When we were working on that, it was a legislative rezoning. It took a lot of money and a lot of time. And I've heard Sarah Showalter say that if we do undertake this rezoning, it will get the same legislative rezoning attention, which is the way it should happen. But meantime, you've done upzonings nearby and spot zonings in the middle of our neighborhood, which will change the way we're deciding on context when we move into the new code. So I see it as a huge problem. The other thing is I see it as a huge expense, and I would like to propose that possibly we discontinue the NPI project for a while until we finish this. The NPI project, in my estimation, is a lot of planners spending a lot of money, a lot of time, creating new regulations which primarily benefit the same class of developers that are benefited currently. And it doesn't really add much to the blueprint and comp plan and the zoning code as a whole. So my proposal would be to save some money there and finish the city first.
Well, I'm taking notes here, and I will certainly pass that along to the leadership at CPD.
So I don't know if Ian is still here, or I should read these questions.
I'm still here.
Okay,
Cindy,
do you
I
want
see that
the
you
questions?
put a question in here. Did you want to ask or you just want me to read it?
You can read it. It's
Okay.
just a little hard for me to read. So-
Yeah, and then, well, I'm not quite sure I quite understand, but as one of the incentives, are you considering rezoning if neighborhoods want ADUs? Also, what other issues that do not go through developers redeveloping would you envision as incentives for neighborhoods to rezone to Chapter 15, away from Chapter 59?
I'm not sure.
I don't know if I understand it. Cindy, you on here?
Yes. I heard Andrew say that developing are changing from Chapter 59 to 2010 zoning code would be done through developers wanting to redevelop. What would be the incentive for neighbors to bring themselves into the Chapter 59 code, especially if they didn't like group living or some of the other things that are going through? What kind of incentives do you envision the neighbors would want to get out of Chapter 59?
So a good example is accessory dwelling units, and it looked like you maybe asked about that in your question, Cindy. ADUs are not allowed in former Chapter 59 residential districts, and so when people in those districts would like to construct an accessory dwelling unit, they do have to come into they do have to rezone their property into the Denver zoning code. Additionally, if they, in a lot of cases, if people want to expand a home or seek Board of Appeals or adjustments relief for a setback issue or something like that, they are also incentivized then because of the clear criteria in the Denver zoning code for those types of requests to come in. And then it's also free. We do not charge for people to rezone their properties from former Chapter 59 zoning. But I think what I would say is that, for most, the vast majority of residential properties, property owners probably don't even really think much about their zoning and would not have a reason to come in and proactively rezone their property. And that is why we're looking at again, in sort of the early stages of looking at a potential legislative rezoning project that would just make those changes in neighborhoods from an R1 or R2 type residential district in former Chapter 59 to an SU single unit district in the Denver zoning code that is aligned with the lot sizes and that sort of thing in a given area.
So are you saying that bulk planes and the standards for remodeling homes or expanding homes is the same, whether it's Chapter 59 or 2010 code?
It is so the 2010 code has more specific regulations on design. The general, I think the general envelopes are mostly the same, and forgive me, I'm not an expert on residential zoning in former Chapter 59, but the building height and setbacks are generally similar, but the upper story articulation and setback measurements and protected district standards and that sort of thing are different in the Denver zoning code, and the regulations in the Denver zoning code are illustrated a bit more clearly as well with graphics and other information like that is left somewhat vague in former Chapter 59.
Okay, so you're saying the pushback would come from regulations that have been passed since or going to be passed. So if they don't want to come into group living, that's a disincentive for them to come into the 2010 code, and you're trying to force that on neighborhoods now. Is that correct?
Well, and I want to be clear that we're just kind of thinking through what it might take to address the inequity between the two codes and, and the challenge of running a city with two zoning codes, and a legislative rezoning that brings existing areas of former Chapter 59 zoning into the Denver zoning code is one idea that's on the table as a possibility. But it would be, up to the city council and the administration to kind of direct us as to whether that should be a priority and something we really focus a lot of attention on or not. But we are also